for a Girls Sleuth series. And a woman who worked at the syndicate actually just went to the New York telephone book, saw the name Dana, and said, that would sound really good. And that's where the Dana Girls came from. So there may be some rhyme or reason behind Carolyn Keene, but we can't say for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, and we have lots more to talk about in our program, but we're going to take a short break to catch you up on what the Humanities Council has been doing lately. Recently, PCN's Brian Lockman sat down with PHC's Ann Benzel, and here's the update on humanities.
Ann Benzel, you are currently the chair of the Pennsylvania Humanities Council. What is the Pennsylvania Humanities Council?
The Pennsylvania Humanities Council is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to promote the humanities and cultural events throughout the state.
What does that word mean, the humanities?
Humanities has many different meanings to different people, but to me, my definition would be the humanities are those elements or entities that touch us in special ways in our everyday lives. For me, it's the arts, it's literature, it's history. The humanities are learning experiences that teach us a lot about who we are, where we came from, and hopefully where we're going.
How does the Pennsylvania Humanities Council promote the humanities?
Through programming. We have some absolutely wonderful programs that are far-reaching across the entire state. I'd love to tell you just a little bit about them. One of my personal favorites are the Commonwealth speakers, who really visit every county in Pennsylvania, telling stories, small performances. Another absolute favorite is Read All About It, and this is through the library system. It encourages not only reading, but discussing what you've read. Another great program that we offer is a grants program. We offer grants to local organizations to support their programs and also to assist in bringing our programs into the area.
How often do you have these events?
We are part of partnerships within the community, weekly, monthly, seasonal. It depends. Check our calendar. It's listed at www.pahumanities.org on the web. I'm sure you'll find something you like.
Well, thank you so much, Ann and Brian. You know, the humanities really are the key to opening the door to the things that we're passionate about, like our culture and our identity. Well, what do you say we go back for more now from Michael Cornelius? Please welcome him.
Welcome to the Drewvolution. And today, the Drewvolution will be televised. I've always wanted to use that joke. For the second part of my talk today, I want us all to consider one simple question. Why Nancy Drew? Why did this character catch on as she did? Why do her sales top all other Syndicate series sales? Why are new versions of Nancy Drew being produced 80 years after she was initially created? There's no question Nancy is a force to be reckoned with. She's a real cultural zeitgeist. She's referenced constantly. And television shows and books and mysteries. You can barely pick up a mystery book today without having some female detective being referred to as a Nancy Drew. And that's a reference we all understand. People who've never read a Nancy Drew book, if you say, she's a Nancy Drew, they know exactly what you mean. That's very significant. That does not happen very often. So why Nancy? And what of her impact on those who read her the most? What is her relationship to that main girl audience? Is Nancy this impossible paradigm, as some people have said, just some height that can never be reached? Is she a prissy upper-class bore, as some other uncouth people have said? Or was she really a feminist hero before such things were common or even really existed? And it's that last question, and it's that last word, the F word, as we often call it at Wilson College, where I'd like to start. Nancy Drew and feminism. So we're going to move ahead a little here. Nancy predates the feminist movement by a good 30 years, but we could still consider her a feminist. And I love the cover here of Clue of the Leaning Chimney, because it seems to really demonstrate in a picture form the contradiction in Nancy's feminism. Here she is climbing a tree, she's snooping in on somebody else, trying to solve a mystery, looking in on the criminals in a skirt. So we have this sense that she's maintaining the proper role and attire of a young girl or woman of her time, but what she's doing doesn't fit that same paradigm. And so we're left with this construction. Is Nancy the action of snooping, or is she the skirt? Is she what she wears? And that's a really sort of humorous way, perhaps, of putting the question. Here's another way of looking at it with these two pictures that I think are really key. The first is from The Hidden Staircase in 1930. And you can see that Nancy, by herself, flashlight in hand, is skulking up the hidden staircase. It's a great image of a woman who is solitary, who is fearsome, who is in charge, who is fearless, I should say, taking control of a particular situation. Sounds like a feminist heroine to me, but if you look at the other picture, this is from a book called The Bluebeard Room, in the paperback continuation of this series from 1985. Nancy Drew, flashlight still in hand. Now she's holding back. The male is advancing forward that she's sleuthing with. He's the one who's about to enter through the door into the Bluebeard Room. Nancy has this look on her face that's somewhere between sort of shock and awe. There's a difference here. And how do we reconcile those two differences? I want to share with you two thoughts from two very different women who've written extensively on this subject. Carolyn Heilbrunn calls Nancy a moment in feminist history. Well, that's a pretty significant thing to say, that Nancy is that important to the history of women and the women's movement in the 20th century. But Sally Perry says that Nancy is the avenging arm of the patriarchy. And what that means is Nancy works to maintain the status quo for everybody, including women. No changes. That she's the one who's making sure nothing ever changes. So Heilbrunn says Nancy's on the forefront of change, and Perry says Nancy works to make sure nothing ever changes. How do we reconcile those differences? And we have to go back to my original question. Why Nancy Drew? And I think there are four answers to why Nancy Drew. Her independence, her feminism, her privilege, because we can't forget that, and her community. So let's look at some of those. Let's look at Nancy's independence. One of the characteristics that is always remarked about Nancy from fans who read her when scholars do research is she's so independent. She gets to do all these amazing things. And here we see images again of Nancy alone. She tends to sleuth alone. She has her chums, she has her boyfriend, she has her housekeeper and her father and a large coterie of hangers-on. But look, she's alone in all of these images, checking out a house, finding a clue, riding a horse, saving the day, solving the crime, hushing out the bad guys. Nancy tends to be alone. This is in spite of her age. She's not an adult. She may be at that age where she could, 18 years old, she could legally vote, for example, but we don't consider her to be an adult. She's just on the edge of being an adult. She's a woman. 1930, she's a woman in a man's world, very much so. So she's doing these things at a time when these are not expected of girls, let alone women, but of girls. And her era, to do this in the 30s, as has been pointed out, she's even more plucky and more forward in 1930 than perhaps she is in 1960. So all of these things she works in spite of, has this independence that she really puts forth, that people really respond to. So where does it come from? Well, she has no mother, and that's a big deal. Mothers tend to be the constraining figures. No offense to the moms in the audience. But in literature, mothers often enact the part of taking responsibility for the children, putting limits on them, making sure they stick to social roles that are prescribed for them. Nancy's mother is gone. This clears the way for her to have a lot of freedom without a sort of strong, dominating female influence, which is odd because she becomes a strong, dominating female influence. But a lot of characters in literature who resemble Nancy, and a lot of girl sleuths that came after her who resemble Nancy, have absent mothers. What about her father? Carson Drew and Nancy are very close. At one point, he almost thinks of her as his partner. They're like friends, not so much as we would think of father and daughter to be. And certainly Carson is really important when it comes to Nancy's privilege. Let's face facts, Nancy's loaded. Well, Carson certainly is loaded. She does not have to worry about her financial situation. In these images you can see, Nancy in a fabulous fur coat, Nancy taking exotic trips to Japan, Nancy in the Grand Canals of Venice on a speedboat. I didn't know you could do that in Venice. I mean, that's pretty amazing. Transportation is not an issue for her. Nancy has crashed her car dozens of times. There's always a new one. That's not a problem. She needs to go somewhere to sleuth. That's not a problem. There are no obstacles for her. And in 1930, right at the beginning of the Depression, one can imagine that was a very powerful, intoxicating facet of the character. What a fantasy. She's not mega rich. She hasn't reached that level. Just all the obstacles of everyday life are cleared. No job needed. So she can really devote herself to her own passions. And of course, her own qualities give her independence, her intelligence, her courage, her determination. One gets the sense that Bess and George could do some of these things with Nancy, but Bess is too timid and George is too hyper. And so Nancy has to go alone. So what does this independence do for her? No work, no responsibilities. She gets to live out her wildest dreams. I mean, I think a lot of us would like to have a life like that where whatever you want to happen will happen. She gets pretty much whatever she wants. Karen Plunkett Powell, in her book on Nancy Drew, shares sort of a humorous take that if Nancy were to apply for auto insurance, she would surely be denied in a heartbeat because she's crashed somewhere in the neighborhood of 18 cars in the first 45 books or so. In fact, in the 41st book, she crashes 2 cars in the first 80 pages. But that's not an issue for her. And I love this picture here on the left-hand side from the Danish Nancy Drew series. It's such a great image of a woman at leisure, well-dressed, sort of like, I'm contemplating something in this book. I don't have worries about life. But what does Nancy do with all of this independence? She rights wrongs. She restores inheritances. She brings criminals to justice. She saves the day, and I think you could see that adequately illustrated in the second picture here on the right. Nancy is being threatened by these men behind the wall. She's trying to save the treasure. She looks courageous, determined. Bess and George are sort of like, let's run, let's go now. And Nancy's the one striding boldly forward. So it's an unusual combination of someone who has enormous privilege to then want to turn around and do something that grants privilege to others. And it's a combination we always admire, that altruism in characters and in people. So how do we reconcile these two very differing ideas of Nancy's character? How do we put them together? And how does that solve the question and the mystery of why Nancy Drew? Carolyn Heilbrunn calls Nancy a moment in feminist history. And when she says that, she focuses on what Nancy gets and on who Nancy is, her freedom, her independence, the character that she has. These are things that women can strive for, look up to, even live vicariously through Nancy. Hope Burwell has this great sort of moment in an article she writes on Nancy Drew where she says, I've done all these things because Nancy did them for me. And that's how she identifies there. But when Sally Perry calls Nancy the avenging arm of the patriarchy, she focuses on what Nancy does. She solves mysteries. She brings people who were once middle class and who've been brought low because of swindlers back to the middle class. She takes the criminal element out of River Heights, which I just have to say, well, it sounds like a great place to live. I'm not buying any property there anytime soon. She takes the criminal element out of River Heights only to put things back the way they were. Nancy is not out there fighting for women's causes. Nancy is not out there on the forefront of the women's liberation movement, although even Harriet Adams, who was no women's liberator, was smilingly said at one point that Nancy certainly was ahead of her time. So Heilbrunn focuses on that act of solving mysteries, that Nancy gets to do it. And Perry focuses on the result of the mysteries that are